I'll start the meeting. So my name is Mary Mallett from Dana, for those who I haven't met yet. This meeting's just going to run for an hour, so we'll get going and keep it pretty tight. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that I am on, which is the Muwinina people here in Hobart, Tasmania. And I extend our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people that are joining us today. So this is some of you took part in a forum that we ran last week, also with Darren and Joel. Last week we had Chadwick Wong from PIAC with us as well. Chadwick had another commitment today at this time, so couldn't join us today. But it's a follow-on about the proposed reforms to the NDIS legislation that are in play at the moment. There's quite a short timeline for those reforms, as the responses close on next Thursday, the 7th of October. There sounds like running water in the background, so if somebody's got their microphone on, could they turn it off? Thanks. And the National Disability Peaks asked the Minister for an extension to the timeline for the legislative reforms, and that extension was denied. So the deadline stays as next Thursday, the 7th of October. Darren or Joel, do one of you want to get started on? There were a couple of questions that were sent through after last week's forum for you to respond to, or to give us your view, and there was another one that you would have only received 5 minutes ago, and then people on the forum can then either put questions in the chat, which you can start to do now if you like, or just put your hand up, and I'll call you out so you can ask a question.
Well, Darren, I mean, I'm happy to start or to let you have a go. I mean, Mary, do we need to give any general overview? Or
I think if you wouldn't mind, I think that would be useful. There will be people on today who were not available or didn't get the invite last week, so that would be really good if you wouldn't mind starting with that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. So I'll have first lash at that, and Darren can correct me where necessary. Yeah, look, this is a package of reforms which is proposed, which draws to some degree, to a significant degree, on the Tune Review, but is not a straightforward replication of the recommendations of the Tune Review. The overarching view, I think, that I have, and that I think that Darren has, is that this is not a catastrophic set of reforms, that there are some things in here which make some sense, but that there are some things which warrant a little scrutiny. The basic structure of the amending legislation, the key sets of reforms that the legislation makes are, first of all, a set of reforms that are about implementing the participant service guarantee, prescribing some timelines, and providing for some more scope for variation of plans. Some injection of greater flexibility into the scheme, broadly speaking, is the second part of the legislation. And then there are a bunch of reforms that are about the scheme having reached full rollout, and there are some legislative reforms related to that. From the Legal Aid Commission's point of view, some of the bigger areas of focus for us are that there is a new variation power, so people's plan can be varied. As you would all know, currently plans can only be dealt with, altered on merits review, either internal review or at the tribunal, or if there is a plan review under Section 48. There's going to be a new variation power, which means that there can be a tweaking of a plan without the plan being replaced. And that's basically a good thing, but the power is unconfined in the draft legislation, and that wasn't what the Tune Review recommended. The Tune Review recommended something narrower, a specific set of circumstances in which it could be exercised. The becoming a participant, or there are new becoming a participant rules which will change the pathways for access, and they in some ways change the pathways, particularly for people with psychosocial disability, but also people with other forms of disability. And there are some tweaks there that we think probably should be made. Those are probably the main areas of concern for us. There's also a set of new plan management rules, and one of the things that is being introduced is this concept of unreasonable risk. If the form of plan management is an unreasonable risk, then the agency can alter the way in which the plan is managed, the category of under which it's managed. And obviously that's a pretty broad discretion when you're talking about unreasonable risk and where there's no structure around that. Those for me, the headline items. Darren, are there other things that you would want to alert people to?
No, I do think the PIAC explainer, I think that's very much the consensus with every lawyer I've spoken to. It's straight down the line, and it's a good thing to have planted early in a very condensed process. I think that idea of structure is the thing that I keep coming back to in terms of, you know, I definitely agree with the diagnosis, and I'm not shifting off the diagnosis that, you know, this isn't catastrophic. This isn't, you know, it's certainly not anything like what we dealt with earlier in the year. But again, I find across all the areas Joel mentioned that there's just points at which you just want to put a bit of structure on things, clarify the purpose for which the power is going to be used, get a little bit more concrete about the situations it's intended to be used in. I think obviously we're a week on, and for those who watched or were at our first session, like one of the things that I've been sort of since in the week that's passed, you know, I think the thing I'm getting an appreciation of is the sort of market levers that are, you know, that are really being set up in the plan and management and plan administration rules. It's always hard to identify which ones. So today I think it's the plan management rules section 6 is, you know, funding and provision of supports included in participants' plans, and it goes into the agency's ability to act as traffic cop basically in the market. Obviously market intervention is the highest version of that. And to, you know, the need to provide reasons for market intervention. I mean, I'll get to a question. We did a really great question we received on market intervention. But I do think, you know, obviously to counterbalance Joel, as I'm the academic, Joel will always have, you know, the casework, the individual, you know, and PIAC the same. I do want to stress that the agency is going to have a lot of new levers to sort of funnel people towards, you know, there's a provision there saying where a support can most effectively or most efficiently be delivered in a particular way by a particular provider, there is a power to funnel the person in that direction. And it gets recorded and they reason through it. You know, there's quite a lot, looking at that section 6, there's quite a lot in there. And again, I can see a reason for most of these powers. I think all of us, if you look at the explanation document, the department has done a good job of pointing to the useful, you know, providing little examples of when they can be used well and usefully. But the recurring thing is, can we put structure on them so they're not applied more broadly than we would anticipate, or can we nudge them to be used with a particular emphasis? And can we nudge, you know, market intervention to go a particular direction, you know? So again, I mean, that's sort of my kickoff. I can't speak for Joel, but my sense today was I hope that we'd have a little bit more interaction, because the amount of wisdom on the call, frontline wisdom, is really great, you know? So I kind of want to get into the questions. I do have the first kind of question if we wanted to dive in. Is that okay, Mary? Or
yes,
yeah.
Yes, thanks, Darren.
So
Yes.
I mean, I didn't get any names on the question, but this was the one. Darren spoke about this is the last time. Darren spoke about opportunities for positive engagement in relation to the NDIA having powers to exercise market intervention in thin markets. The question flags the difficulties in regional and rural areas. What current powers does the NDIA have to engage in market intervention? My understanding of this is that it was envisioned that the agency could only intervene where market failure has occurred. Has this changed? And what changes in power would Darren like to see granted to the NDIA to engage in market intervention? Okay, so this is a product really of our last session where we had to do, like, we were in a fast moving car and we were firing bullets out of the car trying to hit stuff. And I sort of mentioned, look at that market intervention power. How can we use that? And how can we funnel that in a good direction? And the core, this section 6 in the plan management, it speaks about when the CEO, the agency, is satisfied that it is not reasonably practicable for a person to access supports currently, they can engage in market intervention. And market intervention can take various forms. It can involve commissioning a particular provider or dealing with a particular support a particular way. It can involve the flexible use of funds as well, which was a point made by the questioner. I guess the thing in terms of giving structure and giving a nudge, do we need to get a little bit more on what are the factors that influence what is reasonably practicable in terms of access? So when you look at the explanatory document, there's some useful reflections in there by the department where they say, this power will allow us to intervene to make sure a person gets timely access to supports. Well, maybe timely. The idea of a person needs urgent access and we can't, and they need the certainty of urgent access, that's a relevant consideration that could go into the rule. So I guess it's all about, at the moment, market intervention in this model is sort of conducted, at the plan level. When the agency has market data, they encounter a person, and they make a determination that person doesn't have a reasonably practicable avenue to access supports at the moment. There's a provision that sort of says they have to really engage with the person about what they want. We don't want people being funneled to providers that a person does not agree with. So the agency has to pay attention to the person's preferences under this rule. Also, interestingly, there's a reference to the preferences of others. And again, for me, there's an example where there's a sort of supporting business process for market intervention. And I'm wondering, where are the mechanisms for measuring market need in rural and remote Australia? Are they solid? Do we want to put in some provisions on information gathering or engagement with peaks and advocacy organizations around market shortages to kind of give quality evidence for a reasonable practicability finding? So all of that is in section 6. Sorry about the sort of brain dump, but yeah, I might see if we want to move to another question or if someone has a reaction to that.
Thanks, Darren. And so I'll get people to start putting their hands up now if you've got questions, or as I said, you can put them in the chat, but if you have a question and on any aspect of either what is in this legislation or things that you think should be in there and that we should be arguing to be added, or okay, now let me, so Giancarlo, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Darren. It's just a reaction to what you just said. Just wondering, do you see a connection with what you just said about the determination of what's reasonably practicable with the power to with the unreasonable risk that's currently in place and whether or not that's going to influence the delivery of services, particularly in rural and thin markets. And so, if we take the example of insolvency that was used, like, does that then create issues potentially around people being able to self-manage because of the fact that they can't self-manage if they're insolvent, or if they have to be insolvent, whether or not that may have an impact on this direction to guide what is reasonably practicable.
I mean, sorry. I think my reaction, I mean, in terms of the number of specified things for the CEO to consider when determining what's reasonable, practicable, I think it's noticeable that there isn't much there relative to the other powers in the rule. It's a little bit underactive. And I suppose, Giancarlo, my reaction in terms of the relationship between reasonable practicability and risk to participants, I mentioned that I'd like to see cultural safety and Indigenous-led service provision emphasised, that possibility be explored. When we're talking about preferences of individuals, we also need to talk about preferences of communities. I think the other thing that should go into a reasonable, practicable access is the past experiences of an individual with a service provider in terms of safety and in terms, have they had an at-risk experience in the one provider in town? How do we handle that? Surely that's a relevant consideration for what is practicable, what can be practicably accessed. I don't know, in terms of, Joel made some comments on the unreasonable risk, and they were sort of, I think we can move back out to the sort of, the need to put structure on sort of risk-based logic is always difficult.
Thanks, Darren. I'm going to pick up a couple of the comments and questions that people are putting in the chat. Mary from AFTO had said, I think was wanting an example of an unreasonable risk, or Joel had mentioned. Jane, I think that's Jane from BCA, Blind Citizens, asks, is there a legal definition of reasonably available in terms of treatment? Either of you want to have a go at that one, and then I'll go back to another prior question.
Well, I mean, I think the answer on both fronts is that they're pretty broad concepts, and there's not any detailed spelling out. As I don't have all of the rules open in front of me, but I don't think there's detailed spelling out of those concepts in the rules. So this comes back to Darren's overarching point, which is that this arrogates a great deal of power to the CEO and CEO's delegates to make decisions about these things. In terms of, I don't know that I have off the top of my head a good example of an edge case when it comes to unreasonable risk. I mean, one can think of lots of examples of situations which might obviously be an unreasonable risk in terms of plan management, like, there is some real question about the character of the person undertaking the management of the plan, or influencing the person self-managing in a nefarious way, and that would obviously be an unreasonable risk. But I think that one of the difficulties is that it's hard in advance to come up with examples which perfectly illustrate the edge case, and so that they're going to be the hard decisions which the agency is going to have to make, and of course they can in certain circumstances tip over into limiting people's autonomy to manage their own supports. Darren, do you have a particular example that you had in mind as you read that?
Again, I think there was a lot of tensions. Like, if we think about the safeguarding legislation, which the government felt would sail through, if you recall, they were looking to detach it and deal with it in, so they had the Royal Commission was ongoing, and there was difficulty is talking about, the difficulty in putting structure on risk is that by its nature, it's precautionary, as we know. I guess, like, for me, there should be a reference to factors by which we assess risk. And I'm just looking at the great Naomi Anderson. It's great to see that name because I like your work, Naomi. I often read your cases. I would agree that sort of what Naomi's developing in the chat there is factors that signal or ground an assessment as sort of a trigger. And obviously the pattern of plan utilization and the pattern of underutilization in particular can be a legitimate canary in the coal mine. So, like, in terms of trying to put boundaries on unreasonable, I think you want to drag it back away from the risk, inverted commas, and towards reference to indicators of risk that we would all accept. And that would be a good submission, is to sort of say, here are some indicators. And the good thing about that is as well that there's always scope for a provision around early identification of the risk and avoiding the use of the power. Like, we shouldn't let it get to that point. And when you're dealing with this sort of power, it's difficult to oppose a power where there is a risk to the person. No one wants to endanger safety, but we do want to make sure other strategies are tried. So the thing I find a little bit disappointing is, when we see someone move out of self-management, we often need to look again at the assumption about their capacity that underpins their funding level. And maybe they need supports in the plan to grow their capacity for self-management, and we should look at constructively returning them. Sorry, long answers. I
was just going to jump in and say that that all makes total sense to me. Having a look at the explanatory material for the plan management rules, there aren't illustrative examples. Sometimes in this explanatory material you find illustrative examples, but there don't seem to be in this unreasonable risk part of the explanatory material. But two emphases are risk of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So obviously that's going to be anything which sort of tends in that direction is going to be a big red flag. But there is an emphasis on the notion that that putting in mitigations to prevent abusive or exploitative situations, that actually promotes individual autonomy. And so I think that in those situations, autonomy is a reasonable thing to raise in the context of unreasonable risk. I think it's clearly the case that at least in this explanatory material, this is intended to be a balancing exercise.
Yeah. Thanks, Joel. I'm going back to a question that Hayley, I think that's Hayley from Physical Disability Council New South Wales, put at the beginning. I'm concerned that the power of the CEO to vary or reassess a participant's plan, especially in instances where the CEO acts on their own initiative, will come under the Category D rules. Would it be more appropriate to call for the rules made for the purposes of provisions 47A6 and 48.2 to be classed as Category A rules?
Darren, I think you wanted to add a further comment in relation to the last question. So do you want to do that and then jump into this one? Yeah.
So, on the reasonably available aspect, someone asked about, is there a definition of reasonably available treatment? I'm a little concerned that, we're making comments like, oh, that's a bit like DSP, but the supporting detail is there in DSP. We understand the 2-year time horizon, and we have a set time horizon for DSP. It's bad, but there's lots of detail. I know that we need to be careful about being too much sort of saying, oh, reasonably available will work out like the DSP. It's really the problem with the becoming a participant rules is we don't know what the endpoint, what the nature of management is, because it's not defined what managing a condition is. We don't know the timeline, possibly for legitimate reasons, because we want people's doctors to make that call. You know, they are well placed. You know, but it is a case by case power, which is the definition of unstructured, in terms of how long we have to judge someone over. And then we have, you know, we don't actually have the endpoint. We know there's, if a person shows substantial improvement, but we covered that the last day in terms of substantial improvement is, you know, you can show, it doesn't define where the person is, what is the person aiming towards, like the current definition does. The person is always aiming towards remedying the impairment currently. Here it's sort of being managed and experiencing a substantial improvement with no further definition. Okay, that was just the thing on reasonably available treatment. Just on the category A, category D, I think it's relevant to sort of note that this came out of COAG. You know, this was ticked by the people you would expect to demand it stay a category A rule. Okay, so, you know, it is worth, I mean, I did note that the states were comfortable with the redesignation of the variation power to category D, you know, or just to let it be a category D. What I would say about that is, as long as I'm sure that this doesn't become, and, you know, I don't want to become, at times in the last session, I was trying to avoid being Mr. NDIS controversy. So, like, I'm not saying this is going to happen, not alleging that the agency is even thinking of this, but, you know, we just want to make sure that a variation does not become Ronald Reagan's line item review power, where we have a new policy in relation to this support line. In order to achieve consistency, we are going to conduct a variation of this specific support due to our refined policy. We need to do this because we have longer plans now, and we can't wait for 3 years to bring you into line with our new reasonable and necessary actuarially driven approach. Now, right, complete hypothetical, right? But that would be something that would really sort of, that to me is the type of variation for agency convenience that I would like to see ruled out, you know, where you start doing isolated line item reviews. Obviously, I don't think the states would have let it become a category D if that was going to happen, you know. But it's all like, yeah, I mean, I don't know what Joel thinks in terms of A versus D, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, one of my thoughts was exactly your thought, which is that, you know, this did come out of a COAG process. And I mean, and so that's, one presumes that there's been, you know, clear indications given as to how that variation power will be used. I mean, the other thing I would say is something that I think I adverted to last time, which is the very structure of the legislation, where you have a variation power, or the structure of the legislation to be, where you have a variation power and a reassessment power. I think the implication is that the scope of the variation power has to be smaller. And so, you know, there are statutory interpretation reasons rising out of the overall shape of the legislation to think that, you know, that the agency is going to have legal problems if it really runs away with that variation power. Obviously, we would like to see specific restrictions on when the variation power can be used. But even if there aren't, I don't think that there is a complete lack of fetters for the agency to do whatever it wants, which is maybe not, I mean, I've said more comforting things in my life than that, but, you know, there was some comfort to be taken there.
Thanks, Joel. I noticed a comment from Jen from Deaf Australia about underutilisation in the deaf community, and that's there's particularly during COVID era that people have been going out less and they've used less Auslan interpreting, and concerned about the possibility of significantly decreased funds for deaf people into the future if funds are going to be cut based on underutilisation. Now that's more an operational issue, isn't it, for the agency, rather than, there's nothing specifically in this legislation, in these legislative amendments that are going to speak to that, are there?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that is. I think it's a real concern. I think it's one of the things we're really going to have to watch, coming out of the heavy restrictions of the pandemic. That the patterns of usage of supports will change, and we need to be red hot on that across the board. But I think that risk is going to be there irrespective of the structure of the scheme. I may be missing something, and if there's something that I have missed about the legislation, please post that in the chat and we'll seek to respond. But I think that's my view. Darren?
I mean, the only thing I'd mention is the instalment power. So obviously service providers will head towards this, but the rules do sort of give the agency the opportunity to kind of set expectations about the pattern of expenditure. So like in terms of the pattern of payment, rather, in terms of how payment is drawn down for services that are going to be delivered. So there is the ability for the agency to specify the payment of NDIS amounts in installments. And, I'm sort of, I wonder if that's a provision that there is a sort of, I mean, I'm sort of trying to get my head around. I mean, if it's trying to prevent providers, but charging up front for like taking all the money, like what is it? I mean, I can throw open the question to everyone. Like, what is that trying to address in terms of? Is it something that will stop people moving too quickly or using up their funds too quickly? And putting themselves into a situation of not having sufficient funds, the installments. I mean, I think with a lot of the payment stuff, and some of you will have seen the acquittal, the sort of revision of acquitting NDIS amounts, section 46 and section 45, and the renewed emphasis on it is to be spent for NDIS purposes. That's one area where I'd just like to hear from the agency what what the end game is in relation to that,
So if anybody has any comments, you can either put your hand up and turn your camera on and come on and speak, or put something in the chat if anybody has any particular comments about the payments issues. If you've got questions about anything else, Stacey, do you want to come on?
This is probably incredibly cynical, but could there potentially be an opportunity that if someone hasn't fully utilised the first instalment of payments, that is potentially a trigger point to look at future instalments and maybe do a reassessment? And I don't know, the very, very cynical interpretation that I have there, but.
I don't have a strong view on that. I mean, I think it would be a cynical move by the agency, and I think if they started doing that, then I think we'd want to be, reacting pretty strongly. Darren, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I might just share that because I didn't read out the other question we received beforehand, because it's in a similar space. I would be interested to know if the panel has any comments on the proposed changes to payments, with the agency making payments to providers on behalf of participants, and whether this restricts choice and control and privacy for self-managing participants who choose to engage independent contractors without disclosing their disability to them. Now, I guess from my point of view, if we think about it, what we've heard from the agency about payments, they are looking to de-emphasize the submission, holding up payment with the submission of documents. They're trying to make the invoicing process less clunky. And they also want to have some sort of better visibility over the use of plans, and better visibility on how people are tracking in the use of their plan. What are the patterns in spending? There are positives to that in terms of what are the funds that people are finding perhaps easy to spend early on. What are the funds that people are finding difficult to spend? And greater visibility over that is a good use of technology. So again, I mean, when I have gotten questions about these payments by email in other sessions, and I guess it's all about hearing the agency. And there's areas of this legislation where the process itself is about drawing out. I mean, Vanessa made a sort of comment in chat. Should the agency develop and publish guidelines about the intended use of the new variation powers? You know, I think we would say that about an awful lot of this legislation, that, you know, here's a new power, and we don't necessarily have solid expectations about how it's going to be used. So the answer to that one would be yes, Vanessa, and I think it's yes in a lot of areas. Is the more the agency explains what they see as the purpose of the power, the more we can meet that by saying, well, if that's the purpose, shouldn't we make that purpose clearer? So there's a little bit of tennis in the exposure draft process that I'd like to get kickstart, you know.
Darren, can I ask about when you're talking about that? So it's likely, isn't it, that in the political process, what'll happen is this will get referred to a short-ish Senate inquiry. That's likely, I would imagine, that's what's going to happen. So if that happens, then will that give us the opportunity for the agency to have to provide more information and more details about this? About any of these, you know, their sort of intent and reasoning?
I think there are more connected people than I who will have a solid assessment. You know, I think obviously the contents timetable is extremely challenging for those interactions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there certainly will be attempts, I think, being made for that to happen. Lauren O'Brien's got a comment there. Possible assumption around plan instalment approach could be around seeking to avoid situations of all plan funds being fully utilised in a very short period and not stretch across the duration of the plan, and participants then in critical situations where the NDIA was being pressed for additional funds via review. And that is indeed a possible assumption, isn't it? That may be the case, but since they're not explaining themselves, we don't know.
Yeah. Can I also say, Mary, like, I think when we talk about the market governance powers that are in this this set of rules, you know, there's an increased emphasis on effective and efficient in the plan management. You know, is this service provider going to be a source of effective and efficient services? And then there's also the power to say, no, you cannot commission this provider. You know, there's also that emphasis there. I think there is, like, we do need to think, I mean, as the academic on the panel, I'd say we need to make sure that the agency is resourced to make those decisions very effectively. And the whole issue of quality services in the scheme and the assessment of is getting the outcomes and what are the factors that drive those outcomes, and who are the people not getting outcomes, they need to have they've got to have a good solid way of using or making those determinations about providers. And as advocates, you know, it can feel like, I think there's a good chance to have they have a lever now to sort of condemn service providers, or to, you know, sort of say, you know, the outcomes need to be better here. We don't think this service is going to give you an outcome. They have the ability to send people in a positive direction. I think market information and quality assessment, that needs to be there, you know, at the day-to-day level.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Karen Dimmock from ACD, do you want to come on and ask your question that was particularly about families, parents and carers being able to use the plan, part of the plan? This was your question that I picked up late and had only just sent to Darren and Joel, so it's probably better if you want to come on and ask it yourself.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Joel and Darren. This relates to the proposed change to paragraph 14, and which I think some of the changes are about ILC and that perhaps moving back into the agency. But then there is a line about that the NDIS supports participants to meet their social and economic participation, but the change is that it adds into that sentence participants and their families and carers to meet social and economic participation. In supporting children, obviously one of the biggest areas we have is that families are wanting to work or do other things, but agency often knocks back those types of support in a child's plan because they see it as not directly supporting the child. Does this change that?
I don't know that I feel that the changes to 14 are that substantial. It feels to me like, I mean, they're really, as I understand them, an effort to re-articulate somewhat the power of the agency to, you know, spend broadly on supports for people outside of plans. So I see that as more of a tweaking of the language. I did, after I received Mary's email, have a look at the explanatory documents, but I'm just trying to recall. I don't think they said anything terribly insightful in relation to this. I think they just reflected much what I've said, that this is, you know, intended to be a bit of a re-articulation with a bit more precision. Is that your take, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say carers had wins in the tune process. So, but it was sort of saying we need to reaffirm the commitment to the idea that supports can be about building the carer's capacity, which I think is somewhat some of the language around 14 is doing. But they also do, I mean, what you're reporting, and I was sort of leaving space to Joel because, you know, I think legal aid and the advocates on the call, you know, the business case for you know, business casing NDIS supports should include those broader benefits. Like if you take down your operational guidelines, there is this talk about the sustainability of caring arrangements, which should include the fact that a carer needs to have, you know, needs to be out in the world working, needs to, you know, and there are various provisions in the operational guidelines and there are various AATs where the agency gets pulled up for not valuing the benefits to Australia of, you know, changing the care environment in the home that benefits the participants and, you know, frees the carer up to be a better carer, to be out in the world. So the dynamic you're reporting is, in my view, it's something the agency should be getting away from, and it isn't caused necessarily by the legal provisions or their policies. It's more of a frontline practice in terms of the investment logic of the scheme is rapidly shrinking into this defensive insurance. How much will you cost us, the NDIA, rather than what are the benefits of supporting you more broadly? So from that point of view, there is a firming up of language around carers in a few areas, which is what was Tune committed to. But I would agree with the concern that you have about the frontline dynamic and why that dynamic is happening.
I'm going to run through this. There's 3 questions or comments in the chat we'll run through. So one was from Jane Britt, I think from Blind Citizens, a query about the changes in item 33 around acquittal of NDIS amounts, which was, this amendment reinforces that funds must be spent in accordance with the participant's plan, ensuring any funding is spent in a way that will benefit a participant. This in turn helps to ensure the integrity of the scheme. What does this mean for access to non-registered NDIS supports, particularly for self-funded participants? Is this a tightening up of what can or can't be accessed with funding?
Can you take me through that again? I just want to make sure I've got all the elements.
So it's about it's reinforcing that it's about acquittal of NDIS funds. So reinforces that funds must be spent in accordance with the participant's plan, ensuring any funding is spent in a way that will benefit a participant, in turn helping to ensure the integrity of the scheme. So the question was, what does this mean for access to non-registered NDIS supports, particularly for self-funded participants? And is this a tightening up of what can or can't be accessed with funding?
I don't think it changes what you can access in terms of unregistered support providers. I think that it remains the case that there's the capacity to do that. Is that right, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I mean, I think there are some, they wanted to clean up this section, and just the language currently doesn't emphasize that they just want a clearer statement that NDIS amounts must be spent for NDIS purposes. Now, some of you will recall Rick Morton's reporting around the leaked draft there, and the sort of, that's where some of the nervousness around this comes in the community. Now, what this provision is about really is the agency does see transport, they would say there are transport funds being claimed that aren't necessarily disability related in the NDIS sense. So they see that at times people have spent in a way that strays over the interface, strays into non-NDIS purposes. And we know that as a matter of priority, one of the reasons they want to have sort of faster visibility on how people are spending in their plans is so they can look at those and say, hang on, you bought an air conditioner, but you don't qualify to buy you don't meet the conditions of an air conditioner in the sense of the McPherson case and the criteria when the purchase of an air conditioner might be seen as somehow approved. So, there are various, gym memberships, things like that, in terms of they want to have that interface cleaned up, Now, really, the section doesn't do it. It's just a signaling mechanism, because it's a principle that exists. You spend NDIS money for NDIS purposes. The only comment I would make about the potential raising of debts against participants is, and I haven't had anyone, I've never had anyone interact with me about this, but I've always found the debt waiver provisions of the Act a bit disappointing, a bit rigid, given the character of the population within the NDIS, their specific vulnerabilities, the fact they may struggle with some of the complexities of interpreting a plan. I don't know if anyone has any views. As I say, it's just something, I literally have said it in public, and I've never heard anyone agree with me or disagree with me. But, obviously, we know they want to watch non-compliant spending like any government program. And all they're doing is just signaling that a bit more clearly. They're not changing any law as such.
Thanks, Darren. There's a slight discussion happening in the chat about a question from Mary from AFDO about any opinion about the view that the short consultation could breach the CRPD in allowing or not allowing sufficient time to prepare submissions and or support people with disability to develop their own submissions, and others are agreeing with saying that it does breach the CRPD. The Minister is a little bit impervious to that at the minute, but I think organisations will continue to make that point. Angela from Amida's got a question about, or would be good to know about how the legislation will be implemented. For example, the participant service guarantee rules under responsiveness say each participant will be given an effective single point of contact. The agency seems very, very far away from having staff to be able to do this.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I was talking to somebody about this, yesterday or the day before, saying, if there are three variables, efficiency and compliance with the timelines in the service guarantee, if you've got that, you've got time and you've got resourcing, the risk is if there's not proper resourcing, either those timelines are not complied with, or the quality of decision making is much poorer. So yeah, all of this has to be underpinned by a responsive agency and a workforce which is capable of making proper decisions on those timeframes. So I just couldn't agree more.
We haven't got very much more time, so if you've still got questions, please put them in the chat. But I just wanted to ask something. So in this, somewhere in the explanatory material, it says that this legislation, these amendments address 14 of the Tune recommendations. And there's something that says there'll be future legislative amendments to address more of the recommendations. I just wanted a view really from either or both of you about what do we do about that, or should we be, is there any point at this moment in saying, well, we think some of these others should have been addressed, or we kind of, there's a recognition because of this very tight time frame that if they haven't already drafted it and put it in now, it's not going to get in. So, but just, yeah, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's good. It's both good and bad from a kind of advocacy point of view, because I think, hopefully it means there's another, there's an opportunity to make further amendment down the track if the government's flagging that there is going to be future legislation. But also there is a risk that you don't get the full panoply of improvements that the Tune Review proposed, and you never get to that future date of additional legislation. I mean, I think a government is going to want to push through something that looks like this legislation, even if it is willing to countenance some amendment. It's going to want to push something through in the October sittings. So I don't think you can stop that happening in order that all of the other changes proposed are folded in. I think that is going to be a matter for another day, some months or years down the track. Darren, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I mean, obviously there's the point about trying to, the CRPD, which I really think is a really important one, particularly accessibility. But I don't think, has anyone had the chance to map Tune onto this? I try, right? I'm not trying to be a big player in the disabilities. All I do is the technical stuff. So obviously I'm going to focus on this because it's nerdy and it's administrative law. I'm doing a little bit on DSP, like many of the people on the call for the inquiry. And even with that workload, it's just not possible to go back to Tune and start mapping all the narrative sections of Tune where Tune maybe had, just to track how far off are we, only in selected areas have I had a chance to do it. I think they were always going to say there's more to be done because of Tune has some nasties in it, some, reasonable and necessary, tidy up the interface, all of that stuff remains undone. But yeah, I mean, if you ask me, are there any positives of Tune that they've failed to carry forward? I'm not sure the sector can answer that question. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to know. If someone has time, please map the hundreds of pages in Tune.
Yeah. I know AFDO is attempting to do that at the minute, but the time frame is so short. So,
and and it's really hard because of, I mean, the way, like I've looked at Tune mostly in recent times in relation to the variation power, and even that it's actually not a straightforward exercise, even with a relatively short body of text and a relatively brief set of amendments to the legislation. It's not neatly seen in reproduced form in the draft legislation. So there's lots of inferential reasoning you have to do. It's really hard, I think. I don't want to discourage anyone. Do it if you want to do it, but it's not going to be easy.
Just that in our last couple of minutes, I'm interested to know, I suspect it'll help everybody if there's as much sharing as possible of the submissions and draft submissions that people are putting together. So, Joel, I wanted to ask you about the one that the legal aid commissions will be doing. Is there a way that can be shared out with the advocacy sector before it goes in so that people can endorse it or grab bits of it or whatever?
Yeah. Well, Giancarlo asked me about this yesterday, and I undertook to take that away as homework. It's homework that I have not yet completed, but I will be engaging with the other commissions on that question. And at the very least, I think what I could produce is a summary document which laid out, our concerns, so that we, so that that provides a steer for the sector. Not that we have a very particular angle on the scheme, so it's not going to be comprehensive. But I again undertake to do that.
Okay, thanks, Joel. And then the peaks can circulate that out to their member organisations and stuff. So we will do that. And for I'm meeting tomorrow with some of the appeals advocates to talk about what's possible to do in the next week to get in some sort of combined submission. But I know lots of organisations are writing their own. But let's sort of all agree, if we can, to share your draft submissions. It'll be early next week, I'm sure, early mid next week, that everybody will be flying those around to each other. But if possible, it would be good to do that. So as everyone scrambles to get their submissions in. Angela put up the link about the Tune review recommendations and which ones are being dealt with. Thanks for that, Angela. So before we finish up, thanks very much, Darren and Joel, for coming on again to talk to this very interested group of advocates and colleagues in the sector who, are desperate to get this scheme improved to the best we can and try and stop them from doing anything that's going to cause further harm. So thanks very much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And Darren, when there was a comment you were making, I think you referred to the McPherson case about the air conditioner, and it made me realise really we should have done it before, but we should talk to both of you to try and set something up for the future, into the future, maybe on a quarterly basis or maybe only every 6 months, but to run through with the sector about the cases that have happened in the previous period and just the implications of those, because the appeals advocates generally have a handle on it, but there's a broader sector who are also doing some work on reviews and appeals, but who are not doing it every day and who would be helpful if they could understand some of those implications. Yep,
sounds good.
Sounds great. I lost an outlet when my quarterly digest of decisions, the project got run down beyond my control, but I'm looking for an outlet, so I'm happy to do that. And you can always try and drop me a line.
Yep, we'll do. And we'll find a way, I think, to recreate that digest for another purpose. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. And thanks particularly to Darren and Joel for giving us